Well, welcome everyone today. We have a new setup here because we had something called a Kim Koo seminar this morning where about a dozen people sat around this table and talked about issues with Keith and Frank affecting East Asia. But today we're fortunate to have two Beltway insiders to share their insights gained from their deep and rich experience working on Capitol Hill. And both Keith and Frank are evidence that constructive, amicable bipartisanship still exists in some quarters in Washington, D.C. One, I think, is a Republican, and the other, you could say, is a Democrat. Frank Jannuzi is president of the Mansfield Foundation and has written extensively on East Asia policy issues, including U.S. relations with Korea, Japan, and China. From 1997 until 2012, Mr. Jannuzi was senior East Asia policy advisor for Senators Joseph Biden and John Kerry at the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee. What I learned this morning was that Frank's formative years for his profession were spent as a student in China at Beijing Foreign Language University during China's first decade of reform and opening from 1984 to 1988. Keith Luse is executive director of the National Committee on North Korea, aka NCNK. I'm still learning all these acronyms. Mr. Luse was a senior East Asia policy advisor for Senator Richard G. Lugar at the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee from 2003 until 2013. Keith was also staff director for Senator Lugar at the Senate Agricultural Committee from 1999 through 2002. Keith had joined Senator Lugar's Indiana office in 1978 and was appointed state director in 1982.
Thank you.
Stephen?
Thank you. Hi, I'm Stephen Noerper. I head the content effort here in policy, and I'm delighted to welcome you as well. It's terrific to see so many of our regulars and old friends here as we lean into our 60th anniversary year, and we have kicked off a year and a half now of 60th anniversary policy discussions. So we're delighted to welcome Frank and Keith in the context of celebrating 60 years since the founding of the Korea Society. It is a heady year indeed, certainly since the beginning of the year with North Korea's nuclear test, its fourth at the time, its long-range missile or satellite launch in early February, and then ramping through a number of provocative missile launches, the most recent and fifth nuclear test. At the same time, we see a rise in tensions with China over South and East China Sea issues and general concerns on that front that may impact the Korean Peninsula in its way forward. So we have Frank here to talk about the regional arc and with his exposure in particular on China and Japan. And Keith has really played a leading role now in his most recent assignment in elevating awareness on Capitol Hill of North Korea issues and the significant challenges that exists there, as well as perhaps an opportunity over time for negotiation, and we'll try to get to that today as well. We're doing this in the context of the elections, and we have just had our first presidential and the vice presidential debate. We're hoping that many of you will be watching this Sunday as the debate occurs at Washington University in St. Louis, a second presidential debate. Traditionally, the second debate has received more attention on foreign policy issues. We'll see how that plays out. But as we look ahead toward the election in November, a transitional period, which the North Koreans may or may not choose to act in, and then the inauguration of a new president on January 20th, and of course the wind down of President Obama's administration as well. A very heady context then to place all of this in. So if I could ask you, Frank, to maybe start with some general thoughts on where we sit today.
Thanks, Stephen, and thanks to the Korea Society and my good friend Keith Luse and Tom for arranging this program. I especially am grateful for the Mansfield memorabilia that has been installed in the lobby. If you didn't notice it on your way in, I think that's kind of a traveling exhibit set up partly in recognition of Mansfield's role. And Mansfield was famously ambassador to Japan for 11 years, the longest serving U.S. ambassador to Japan. But a lot of people don't know that he wrote his master's thesis on U.S.-Korea diplomatic history. And we've recently republished that thesis on our website, and it holds up remarkably well. It's almost a 100 years old document. And also yesterday was the 15th anniversary of Senator Mansfield's passing. And so I'm very mindful today of his spirit of bipartisanship, his lesson that he gave to my former boss, Senator Biden, to never impugn another person's motives, and his commitment to U.S.-Asia engagement through his long tenure as Senate Majority Leader. So I'm glad to have the spirit of Mansfield in the room, and I will try to encourage all of us to reflect on what we've lost in the Congress, but also what might be regained. I want to briefly talk about the Asia strategic environment that will be greeting the next U.S. president, and touch on a couple of the key challenges. And I will let Keith drill down a little bit deeper on the Korea challenges that he is immersed in his role as leader of the National Committee on North Korea. And I'd start off by sort of stating the obvious, which is that Asia has not gotten any less important over the last 8 years. But notwithstanding President Obama's pivot to Asia, the rebalance to Asia, the reality has also been that other foreign developments continue to drive much of the debate in Washington and to command the lion's share of the attention in Washington. So the Syrian refugee crisis and civil war, the unfinished business in Iraq and ISIS, Russia's occupation of Crimea, these events, more than the extraordinarily important developments underway in East Asia, continue to dominate the discussion in Washington, despite the best efforts of people like Keith and I to sort of push Asia onto the agenda. Having said that, the rebalance strategy is also going to come under some serious scrutiny next year, because even though it is a signature accomplishment of Secretary Clinton, that does not mean that she is satisfied with the progress made trying to advance U.S. interests in Asia, or that she can simply persevere with an Asian pivot strategy that has arguably failed to accomplish two key tasks. One is stabilization of the U.S.-China relationship and ensuring that it's on a constructive trajectory of win-win cooperation rather than win-lose, zero-sum competition. And the second obvious failure is North Korea. And obviously North Korea's own behavior has something to do with the frustrations that we face on the peninsula. It's not all about U.S. policy failure. But I do believe that the strategic patience approach is one that is lacking in strategy and probably has too much patience and is not going to endure for very long in the next administration, whether it's Clinton or Trump. So first on China. The U.S.-China relationship remains the driver of the U.S. interests in the Asia-Pacific region. Mansfield famously said that the U.S.-Japan relationship was the most important bilateral relationship, bar none. I think that's still probably true, but it's true for a different reason. It's true because managing the rise of China requires a really healthy, strong, collaborative U.S.-Japan alliance. It's not true because the U.S.-Japan alliance per se is the most important driver of events. It's that the United States lacks the capacity to manage events in the Asia-Pacific realm if we do not have strong partners. And I would argue that the most important of those partners is Japan. Probably the second most important of those partners is the Republic of Korea. And the difficulties between Japan and Korea are therefore of strategic consequence for the United States. And it's incumbent upon the next U.S. president to continue the small but meaningful improvement and progress that has been made in helping the Republic of Korea and Japan overcome historical differences and forge a cooperative approach to managing the challenges of Northeast Asia. But this U.S.-China relationship, that's going to be the driver. And as Tom was saying, I I first went to China in 1984, and it was a time of unbounded optimism in U.S.-China relations. The United States was providing military hardware to the Chinese, upgrading their air force, upgrading their submarine technology, upgrading their torpedoes. A lot of Americans don't know this, but they were our strategic ally against the Soviet Union. They were working with us in Afghanistan, and we were opening up trade doors and economic investment, but we were strategic partners. And so everywhere I went in China in 1984, 85, 86, I was greeted as a welcoming dignitary. Who's this 20-year-old American coming to visit our village in Chengdu? And I would show up at a woman's house, and the grandmother would be in the courtyard there, and 400 people would come out of the fields and curious to ask me questions about America, about life in the United States. That China is no longer with us. The plus side is it's a much more cosmopolitan, globally integrated China, much richer. A lot of those villages either cease to exist or have been depopulated with movement to the cities. The downside is this more confident, successful China is also beginning to throw its weight around in the region in ways that the United States finds unattractive. Bullying neighbors, laying claim to undefensible claims to ocean terrain and man-made land features of the South China Sea. And fundamentally calling into question the pro-engagement strategy the United States has pursued with China for 6 presidencies. And so you have very learned, serious people at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington calling for a containment strategy of China. That's a new development, and it speaks to the lack of confidence that the United States has in the trajectory of China. So why is this important? Well, it's not only important because China and the U.S. are sort of number one and number 2 economies in the world, but it's important because that relationship, that U.S.-China relationship, is going to be decisive in how challenges like the Korean Peninsula get resolved. And if we don't have a really good working relationship with China, it's hard to imagine a very successful outcome on the peninsula. The U.S.-China relationship, the tension in it, creates the space within which the DPRK is able to continue its irresponsible behavior. So to the extent that the U.S., China, ROK, and Japan can become in closer alignment about their goals and objectives on the peninsula, it'll be better for our diplomacy and our efforts to manage that challenge. Now, we have other challenges in Asia that the pivot has not done a very good job addressing. That includes a backsliding on democracy and good governance. So you look at Thailand, Philippines, Cambodia, and you see significant challenges in the areas of good governance and human rights protections. And those have grown more severe, notwithstanding the enhanced U.S. attention to the region called for under the pivot. And we're going to need partners to address those challenges. Ideally, China should be one of those partners. They're not very much right now. It's more a competitive realm with China rather than a collaborative one. Other challenges in the region include the economic architecture. And the Asia-Pacific is fundamentally a geoeconomic sphere. The underlying rationale for the pivot had much to do with the balance of U.S. economic interests shifting from Europe to the Pacific Rim. That's where the engines of economic growth are. It's where the majority of new investment and new GDP growth is coming from for the planet. But the signature component of the pivot to Asia, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, is on life support and probably is going to see the plug pulled on that life support system after the November elections. I'm very pessimistic about the ability of the U.S. Congress to pass TPP. I think both Secretary Clinton and Donald Trump mean what they say when they say that they're against it. Secretary Clinton has said that she's against it in the past, she's against it now, and she's going to be against it in the future. It's a pretty unambiguous comment and pretty hard to walk back if she's elected president. Donald Trump says not only will he not support TPP, but he's going to tear up other trade agreements or renegotiate them, including the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. So let me, having put politics on the table, let me turn briefly to it before turning to Keith. If the imperative of the pivot to Asia remains, if the strategic rationale remains, Asia is really important. It lacks regional security architecture upon which the United States can rely. Therefore, the United States has to have its alliances to help manage the security challenges of the Asia-Pacific. And if there's a lot of uncertainty in the Asia-Pacific region, including the trajectory of China and the wild card of North Korea, if all of that is true, then the next president is going to have to not just sustain the rebalance, they're going to have to address its weaknesses. Most important of these is the failure to come to terms with China in a constructive way, to convince China that we're not out to contain them, to reinforce our commitment to global norms and values that we care about, including freedom of navigation, but not only that, and find a way to be patient. Maybe the place where we need strategic patience most is not with North Korea, but with China. So we're going to have to address that weakness, and we're also going to have to address the failure of North Korea policy. Because, as Keith may elaborate, North Korea's threat is growing. They don't need an ICBM to potentially deliver nuclear weapons against U.S. or allied targets. They have other ways to do it. And the peninsula is not at equilibrium. The situation continues to get worse and worse across all dimensions. So those two challenges have to be addressed. And the two candidates for president have different declaratory policies and different styles that they would bring to those challenges. Clinton so far has basically said she's going to stick with the pivot, but she has signaled a more muscular approach when it comes to China and the South China Sea, essentially drawing a red line about U.S. freedom of navigation rights in the South China Sea. And it was on her watch as secretary that this problem has grown, not blaming her, but the Chinese assertiveness, the U.S. assertive response, pushing the two countries into a much more adversarial posture toward each other in the South China Sea. I think that's a situation that ought not be allowed to fester. So we were asked this morning, should the president's first trip overseas be to Beijing? I said, well, maybe not. Maybe it's Andrea Merkel. But her second trip, if it's Clinton, should be to meet with Xi Jinping. And the second thing that Secretary Clinton has signaled is that, well, she's against TPP. For many of us, that's a disappointment. We had hoped that the TPP agreement would be one that she would rally behind. But there's no leadership now in the U.S. Congress politically in support of TPP. Even those who are on paper supporting it have been very quiet in their support. And barring a miracle in the lame duck session, I think TPP is going to be set aside for the foreseeable future. So what does she do in its absence to promote growth, integration, opportunity for U.S. business in Asia? We don't have a roadmap yet. Trump, on the other hand, has said things about what he would do, which might be dismissed as posturing, and could be, in one most favorable light, could be construed as a bargaining tactic. But I think it's important to recognize the damage that has already been done to trust in Asia, in the United States, by some of Donald Trump's remarks. I have been approached by a steady stream of senior Japanese, Korean, Chinese leaders, officials, scholars, private sector officials over the last 3 months. And they always begin the statement the same way. They say, Frank, as you know, our country would never want to take a position or in any way interfere in your domestic politics. But, and then they launch into what can only be described as panic mode about their concerns about what will happen to the United States as a reliable interlocutor should Donald Trump become president, because of the words that he has spoken have resonated in Beijing, in Tokyo, and Seoul, and they have shaken confidence in the reliability of the United States as an ally. And they've also shaken confidence even in the predictability of the United States in pursuit of its interests in Asia. So I think the damage, in a way, has already been done. So if he becomes president, the first job for Trump is going to be damage control and damage mitigation, attempting to rebuild and restore confidence in the Asian capitals. And that's not going to be easy, because there's already been, for a long time, some uncertainty in Asian capitals about America's staying power. Indeed, the whole rationale of the pivot was partly to provide that kind of strategic reassurance to our friends as well as to potential adversaries, that the United States was in Asia to stay and that we would be a reliable partner. So let me close by sharing just a short story about Biden and Asia. Biden was a great boss, and one of the things he taught me was to never impugn motives, but also to never try to lecture another country on their national interests. And whenever he would engage with Asian leaders, he would always listen to them. It may seem hard to believe from Biden, but he always listened to them about their interests, right? And what they thought their interests dictated, rather than trying to tell them what their interests were. It's a really good instinct that Biden has. And it manifested itself in his visit to China with me in 2001, when we were seeking to solicit China's support, not only in managing the North Korean problem, but also dealing with an ornery Iranian state that was arming itself with missile technology that might call into question the safety of the U.S. fleet, Fifth Fleet. And Biden listened to the Chinese and talked about how they should appreciate that the United States really valued China as a partner, and that in 2001 as a growing trade and investment partner, economic partner, and that the United States wanted to forge cooperation with China on global issues of significance, right? Now, we see some success on that with things like climate change, and we've had some partial success with it on North Korea, and Iran, right, on all three of those areas. And the way it came about was not by Biden telling the Chinese, you have an interest in working with us in Iran. It was in Biden listening to the Chinese talk about energy security and the need for stable oil flow from the Middle East, and coming to realize the extent to which their own actions might imperil that. Or North Korea, realizing that the Chinese had more to lose than anybody from an unstable Northeast Asia. I hope the next president will bring that spirit to the current situation, because we need a listening tour in Asia. Beijing perceives containment. North Korea perceives an America out to overthrow their government. We need not to think necessarily that their perceptions are correct. Maybe we think they're wrong, but we damn well better listen, because we can't lecture them on where their interests lie. And the Chinese right now are plagued with serious doubts about America's strategic intentions. And those doubts impair cooperation on the most vital national security threat we face in Northeast Asia, which is North Korea. So let me stop there and turn over to my good friend Keith, who will agree with everything I've said, or not, as is his wont.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Thanks, Frank. Keith?
I always agree with everything Mr. Jannuzi says. However, sometimes I'll have additional perspective. It is a delight to be here today. I want to thank the Korea Society for this privilege, and especially to be with a group of individuals who carefully follow and care about East Asia issues, and in particular those related to the Korean Peninsula. Now, Frank has provided, from his perspective, a broad brush approach in terms of East Asia. I'm going to focus primarily on North Korea. And then both of us look forward to your questions. but more importantly, to hearing what you have to say, your comments as well. It was in the August 18, 2003 edition of the Washington Post. Henry Kissinger presented an op-ed entitled, quote, "The Six-Power Route to Resolution," hailing the agreed-upon venue as a road to resolution regarding the North Korea situation. Secretary Kissinger was emphatic about prospects resulting from China's role. He said, quote, "China's conduct has left little doubt that it seeks a resolution to the North Korea nuclear situation, and urgently. It has declared a North Korea nuclear military program unacceptable and has been the driving force in assembling the new forum," end of quote. 13 years later, in fact, just 3 weeks ago, giving a speech before the New York Historical Society, candidate Clinton stated, quote, "It is clear that the increasing threat posed by North Korea requires not only a rethinking of the strategy, but an urgent effort to convince the neighbors, most particularly China, that this is not just a U.S. cause. It, meaning North Korea, will be on the top of my list in dealing with China and how we are going to prevent what could very well be a serious conflict with North Korea," end of quote. Also, last month, during the presidential debate, candidate Donald Trump spoke regarding North Korea. Quote, "We're doing nothing there. China should solve that problem for us. China should go into North Korea. China is totally powerful as it relates to North Korea," end of quote. So friends, as of today, it appears that the next president of the United States intends to outsource our North Korea policy to China, to outsource our North Korea strategy to China. It's clear that neither have given much attention to the topic at hand, and I understand that. They're in the fight of their lives. They want to win the election. Well, and by the way, in defense of Secretary Kissinger and his quote, at the time the Secretary provided his perspective related to China and its role, possible role, he had reason to be optimistic, and I give him credit for that. But some of you here today may be saying, now, Keith, you're being somewhat unfair. Keith, you know, remember that there's going to be this North Korea policy review under any new administration. Well, indeed, there will be. But, you know, North Korea won't be waiting on a policy review. And it's likely that North Korea will opt for additional provocative action prior to January 20. You know, by now, for 13 years, we have worn the same hat. It does not fit. 13 years of reliance upon China. Now, having said that, while there has been this policy and that policy along the way, there is in Washington, on the part of our government, a lot of disagreement within the bureaucracy. What should our North Korea policy be? So even if a president suggests that this is his policy or it might be her policy, there will be the internal workings within the bureaucracy that may not, in fact, agree. And there has been a mindset on the part of many along the way that we don't really need to be concerned that much with North Korea because, after all, it will collapse. This government will end. And so we focus more on the Middle East, which we should be focusing on the Middle East, or here or there. And aside from regime collapse and that particular conviction, there's been a prevalent spirit at the United Nations, in Washington and other capitals, that more and more sanctions will result in regime behavior on the part of North Korea. I have no doubt but what North Korea has modified its behavior in some shape or form as a result of sanctions here and there. But friends, all of the sanctions in place today have not brought an end to North Korea's nuclear program, its chemical program, its biological weapons program. In January of 2009, it's estimated that North Korea had a nuclear inventory of 5 weapons. Today, the estimates range between 20 to 22. Now, as North Korea proceeds with missile launches, nuclear tests, it grows closer to achieving miniaturization of a nuclear weapon, which could be placed on a missile capable of reaching the United States. Now, there are some who believe that that could occur sooner rather than later. It is a personal opinion that at whatever point experts within the United States security community determine that North Korea has that capability, it is a personal opinion the United States may very well take action of its own. But that's in the future. Whether that future be months or years away, the reality is that today, North Korea has the capability, through its trading company network and global affiliates, to place weapons of mass destruction in the United States and throughout the world. Now, let's pull back for a moment and consider, through the years, there have been a variety of approaches to North Korea. 1995, in testimony before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Ambassador James Lilly, who had been on a trip to North Korea, Ambassador Lilly testified, and he provided an outline, a roadmap for dealing with North Korea, which included steps for engagement. In 1999, Richard Armitage, who at that time had been in the Pentagon but not yet as Deputy Secretary, Armitage and a working group, which by the way happened to include Frank Jannuzi. I forgot you're that old, but the Armitage proposal included a recommendation for comprehensive engagement with North Korea. Now, for comprehensive engagement to work, it requires both parties. We look to the early Obama administration, I believe Secretary Clinton, Assistant Secretary Campbell, Deputy Assistant Secretary Scott Marciel. They deserve credit in moving the Burma issue ahead. They had a plan. They came to the Hill. They suggested, why don't we try to move ahead with the military junta, and let's do this in a way where we have a basket of options. And so as we take action, they take action. Senator McConnell said, let's try it. Senator Feinstein, let's try it. The Secretary Clinton, the Obama administration, they went down that road, and we saw a very good beginning to what is continuing, however difficult, but continuing road of reform inside Burma. That happened as a result of engagement. That happened as a result of a plan, a comprehensive plan. That also did require a willing partner, which Burma was, which some, and I understand this, would say, Keith, North Korea is not there. They're not a willing partner today. Well, why is that? If you're sitting in Washington, in my mind, there is a significant lack of trust on both sides. Neither country is talking to each other today. We are at a point of major escalation on all sides. So how do we get beyond this? How do we have engagement that is constructive? I think it's important, and we first acknowledge that on the U.S. side, there's not a lot of trust for North Korea. Given the fact that North Korea has these cycles of behavior, provocative actions followed by outreach, charm offensives. This approach has worked for North Korea over the years, hasn't it? Now, if you're sitting in Pyongyang, you're going to say, why in the world would I want to strike a deal with the President of the United States? Because if, in fact, we have an agreement with the President of the United States, the Congress may not support that deal. Secondly, even if the Congress would not object, we're not convinced that the president can deliver in terms of the people within his or her own administration? In other words, can the President of the United States actually deliver a unified approach on the part of those within the bureaucracy? Well, this all leads to a number of questions, and I will conclude with just a few questions that are intended to really create more questions on your part. One of those questions, Frank talked about China, United States, and indeed, China may be a factor in final resolution of the North Korea situation with the United States. Having said that, as the new administration embarks upon a policy review in terms of U.S.-China relations, should the administration also examine very carefully the process by which U.S. policy is implemented in terms of China? I submit yes. But the same with North Korea. The same with our policy approaches in a number of countries. So the question becomes, will a new administration be willing to engage not only in a policy review related to China and North Korea, but will a new administration be willing to also engage in a review of process related to implementation of that policy? Secondly, to what degree is the maintenance of the status quo on the peninsula, that is North Korea serving as a buffer between the United States and China, to what degree is this a determinant in the development or implementation of U.S. policy toward North Korea? The Chinese aren't displeased that North Korea continues to exist as is in terms of the United States. And there have been people in Washington and elsewhere throughout the U.S. who will come up, whisper in the ear and say, Keith, you need to think about this. If North Korea goes away as a problem, what do we do about China then? Where is the buffer? So that is another question. The final question is, given the stark differences about North Korea policy approaches and the resulting sharp knives held among key players rooted within the bureaucracy of the executive branch of any administration, will it be possible for the next president to develop and implement a consistent North Korea policy? Will this really be possible without appointing a powerful special policy enforcer, or czar, someone who would report directly to the president, someone who would serve as the president's direct liaison to the North, someone who would oversee the interagency process, and someone who would represent the president directly with the Congress? And if the next president is serious about developing a comprehensive North Korea strategy, they will pull the Congress in from day one in terms of consultation. Congress will be a part of that process if we are interested, in my opinion, with a truly successful, consistent, long-term policy. Now, on the part of North Korea, on the part of China, if either country, their leaders have issues with U.S. policy approaches, they can wait, can they not, until the next election or until there are changes of some sort. This is an important and worthwhile price of democracy. We have elections, they have consequences. But through all this, in terms of North Korea, the question becomes, how long is it going to take? How many nuclear weapons are the limit? 30, 40, 50? How many? To what degree will the United States continue to allow the development and the growth of North Korea's nuclear arsenal? Now, in conclusion, I believe that while both candidates today speak of China as the alternative, I believe that both candidates, that either, once they are in office, I believe that they will probably reconsider and that they will review all approaches. In my personal opinion, I hope that engagement is one of those options that they will pursue. Unfortunately, there are those who suggest that willingness to engage with an adversary equates to agreement with the adversary. That is a mistake. And as relates to North Korea, we may very well pay an enormous price if we continue to be willing over the long term to engage in a comprehensive way, understanding that this also requires North Korea's participation as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both. Very thought-provoking, and we will turn to the audience in just a minute, but let me ask you a question or two prior. Both candidates receive a national security review daily. They have now for several weeks in preparation for one of them becoming commander-in-chief. Whether it is October 10th, which is the party anniversary, also conveniently located near a U.S. presidential candidate debate, or whether it is in the interregnum period, which coincidentally Kim Jong-un's birthday falls on January 8th. This year's test was January 6th. Should there be a sixth or a seventh nuclear test or some sort of other provocative action, how would you advise those candidates, not the president himself, and what are the options, especially in light of some of these challenges vis-a-vis China or our over-reliance on China and with our allies?
Go ahead. First, I want to agree strongly with what Keith said about outsourcing U.S. North Korea policy to Beijing. I think it's a huge mistake, mostly because I think that China does not share U.S. or South Korean long-term objectives on the Korean Peninsula. I think China shares our frustration at North Korea's nuclear program and the way that it is stinking up the neighborhood. But I believe that long-term, China would prefer to see either perpetuation of a buffer state, preferably one that is reforming economically and not such a burden and not such an irresponsible player, or unification, but unification with a kind of a neutral Korean state emerging from the aftermath of unification, one that is responsive to Beijing's instructions and Beijing's position as first among equals in East Asia. So I don't think we share that long-term strategy with China, so I think it would be a huge mistake to outsource our policy to China. I had a meeting with North Korean officials in December of 2008 after Obama was elected. And it happened here in New York, and I remember it vividly, almost every exchange. And the message that I and others delivered was, give us time, chill, behave yourselves. We have a new president coming. He has campaigned on the goal of engaging with you. You have a responsibility, if you want engagement, to help create the necessary environment for that to take place. Now, North Korea chose to shape the environment in ways that we didn't like, right? They chose to shape the environment through a satellite test, a missile test, followed by UN sanctions, followed by a nuclear test. Doesn't mean they weren't listening to me and others. It just means that they chose to shape the environment in ways that they thought were more muscular, meeting the new president with that kind of a challenge. I agree with Keith and Steve, your question. It seems likely to me that North Korea will do the same this time around, one way or the other, lay down markers about how tough they're going to be. The problem for the United States will be not to misinterpret these signals. It doesn't mean that North Korea is unwilling to engage. In fact, you could argue the opposite, that they're shaping the negotiating environment in preparation for such talks, much arguably as Mr. Trump may be shaping the environment when he talks about South Korea getting an independent nuclear capability. Maybe that's just his way of laying down a marker. Push us hard enough and we may do things that you don't like. I think for me, this all comes down to the word provocation, Steve, that you used, because your question very perceptively captures the way that the United States for the last 8 years has been viewing North Korea's actions. And it's not just the US, by the way. I mean, it's also the South Koreans and the Japanese and to some extent the Chinese. North Korean nuclear test is a provocation. Missile test is a provocation. The United States conducted 1,054 nuclear tests from 1945 to 1962, including 250 atmospheric tests. We didn't consider any of them to be provocations. We considered them to be developing our nuclear capabilities. North Korea is methodically developing their nuclear capabilities. And we need to begin to appreciate that this isn't all about politics. It's also about power and capability and security. So there's a political dimension, but to me a provocation is shelling an island, sinking a frigate, blowing up soldiers in the DMZ. That's a provocation. There's no strategic rationale for that. But a nuclear test, an ICBM test, a road mobile missile test, a submarine missile launch test, I call that military research and development. And if we don't like it, we have to engage with them to convince them that it's counterproductive, but not to view it always in political terms, because it's both political and strategic in terms of their capabilities. And I expect it to continue without cessation for the foreseeable future. There's a reason why we conducted 1,054 nuclear tests. We wanted to perfect our capabilities, and so do they. I'm sorry, the question about our economics?
Wait, we're not at the Q&A yet.
Yeah, okay,
We'll
we'll wait.
get back to that.
We'll get when the mic can capture you for the live stream, too.
In the event, in the likely event that North Korea proceeds with what U.S., UN, and other officials determine to be one or more provocative actions between now and January 20 or thereafter, there will be a response on the part of the United States and the part of the United Nations, whether that be in the form of additional sanctions or whatever. The North Koreans are anticipating that. And so if they proceed with a provocative action or one or more, in their thinking, they will have determined that they will be able to withstand whatever the U.S., the UN response may be. They may be wrong, but that's probably their thinking. Once the new president is in office, ideally, they would appoint someone as a North Korea policy czar, a high-profile individual. The higher the profile, the more North Korea will view the president as being serious about engaging with them. But then it's up to that policy czar to carry a message to North Korea, and that message would include an outline of the new president's strategy thoughts that would have been prepared in consultation with South Korea, with China, Japan. And it is likely that that engagement proposal would include, whether you want to say carrots and sticks, pros and cons, positives and negatives. I think in an ideal situation, on one hand, that strategy outline would be very clear that from that point on, if North Korea engaged in actions that were deemed provocative, XYZ would occur. But it would be a mistake for the next president to be explicit in terms of that red line unless the president is truly prepared to follow through. So I think what's important in terms of dealing with North Korea is that we be consistent, is that we do what we say, as opposed to simply issuing press releases saying these actions are unacceptable, on and on and on. Well, as long as the United States does not, in fact, enforce a red line, North Korea will continue to test to determine how far they can go.
Okay. Well, thank you, Frank and Keith. And this certainly was an admirable demonstration of bipartisan opinion sharing here. So thank you for coming, and thanks for your questions.
Thank you
I'd
all.
ask you, please fill out the evaluation forms. That's the one form we really need
Yeah.
to monitor our programs and also improve our programs and hear back from you if there's any way we can improve the programs. So thank you.
And if I can
you wanna
have
make some
less than a
final-
minute more of your time, we would like to thank Keith and Frank, but also note that we admire the great work that Mansfield Foundation does, as well as the Mansfield Center in Montana, where the Korea Society has had a national program and where we just appeared with Ambassador Sung Kim, and also the National Committee on North Korea, which does so much great work and has really a very distinguished grouping. I'd also like to thank a few people here specifically who should go with note. One, Phil Sherman, who is sitting in the first row here. Phil has generously donated to what will be announced next week, which is the Sherman Korea Emerging Scholar Lecture Series. And we're very delighted to be honoring a young academician in Korean studies through his largesse. I would like to thank Helena Kalenda to my right and Li Ling from the Luse Foundation, to Alexander Ilichev, our resident expert formerly with the United Nations, to Dane Josetta Capriati from the Foreign Policy Association, and to all of those streaming online. This is available, by the way, to you on podcast, or if you would like to see it by video, and we would encourage you, if you are not a member, to please go to koreasociety.org. Please join us November 3rd for our next Thursday session with Ralph Casa of CSIS Pacific Forum. And join us, please, here on December 12th when Ambassador Robert Gallucci and Dr. Victor Cha will present a report of recommendations for the newly elected president. That will be a 10 a.m. event, and you can see our calendar online or take a physical calendar with you here today. For those of you who are streaming in from the California area on December 6th, Tom Byrne, as well as Ambassador Kathleen Stevens and General Walter Skip Sharp will be presenting on the new challenges for the president in Korea and Northeast Asia. That is at 12 noon in Encina Hall at Stanford University. Thank you all again, and have a wonderful day.